Hello, this is David Pan. I'm the editor of Telos, and I'm here with Shih, who teaches the anthropology of knowledge, international relations theory, and China studies at National Taiwan University. He recently published Eros of International Relations, South-Feminization and the Claiming of Post-Colonial Chineseness and Post-Chineseness, Cultural Politics and International Relations. Um, so he published recently in Telos 202 his article, Loving Hong Kong, Unity and Solidarity in the Politics of Belonging, and we will discuss his article today. Welcome, Chih.
Hello, thank you for having me here.
All right, so let's just get right into this. In your essay, you first you set up this opposition between a kind of Western liberalism and a kind of Confucian approach to benevolent love. You talk about. You first talk about liberalism. So why do you can you explain why liberalism is based on universal love rather than universal rights? Is there a difference between the two? How do you
Oh,
see liberalism?
I think that's a very important question. I think liberalism, of course, is based upon universal rights. I I meant to argue that universal love is a therapy for liberal individuals who are entitled to rights. Each of them supposed to be autonomous, but actually they must be related to each other in society, in community, in all sorts of networking. But then the discourse requires them to act and think of themselves as individuals, autonomous individuals. So people must try to relate, and universal love is a way to relate as liberal individuals develop passions for universal human rights. So they will be very concerned about how universal human rights being implemented elsewhere, and they feel sorry and feel anxious when seeing the violation of universal human rights elsewhere. So they develop this kind of solidarity. So loving people, caring for the condition of rights of other people is a way I consider as a therapy to overcome this kind of a separation premise in liberalism. So that's that liberalism is not defined or constituted by universal rights, but universal love. But universal love is a necessary therapy to overcome this obsession with independence, autonomy.
Oh, okay, great. That helps a lot. Okay, thank you. So then you describe in your essay both kind of rights-based liberalism and communitarianism in the West. What is the relationship between the two?
I think communitarianism is more concerned about solidarity, but classic liberalism, in terms of their pursuit of individual rights to protect property rights and rights to life, they are more concerned about protecting individuals. And this preoccupation with protection of individual rights certainly overlook the necessity of having communities and people helping each other. I think communitarianism is a sort of a solution to this over-reliance on individuality or this individualist consciousness, so that people would feel obliged to help each other as individuals. Communitarianism would look at individuals being related already because they are all constituted by human rights, universal human rights. So people are related. They are all similar in the sense they all have this entitlement to human rights. Because of that, so people would naturally feel anxious if someone else rights being violated. And I think communitarianism stress this kind of prior relationality already existing in liberal society, which has been ignored or not being stressed sufficiently by classical liberalism.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, so you set up this opposition within the kind of discourse of liberalism and communitarianism, but then you also set up an opposition between a kind of Western approach and this Confucian approach. So how do you differentiate between then Western universal love from between that and a Confucian benevolent love? What's how do you see that?
Well, I
working?
think this conceptual division is only for the sake of discussion. In terms of actual human beings, I think people can practice both universal love and Confucian benevolent love. So it's not binary in terms of dividing populations or territory or society or nations in terms of one belonging to a particular culture of love and the other belong to the other one. It's not that kind of binary. The binary is a conceptual for the purpose of discussion and for the purpose of speech. I think Confucian love is not familiar to most readers or audience in Anglospheres. Confucian love is not about emotion. When we talk about love, we usually consider love as an emotion. So you feel anxious when other people's rights being violated. However, Confucian love does not necessarily carry emotion. It can carry emotion, but does not have to. It is a love to show your duty. People in a higher position is supposed to show benevolence. And if they show benevolence, that means people underneath or subordinate to her can feel comfortable or safe together with her under her leadership, since she's being selfless, she's being benevolent. So all the people loyal to her can feel they can feel comfortable with each other. They don't feel being threatened by each other, even though they don't know each other. And this is very different from liberal love or universal love, because universal love exists between individuals who are socially strangers. Benevolent love spread to all those people who presumably are loyal to one single leader. And so they are related in that sense, just like a parent, a father or mother, together with children, and children with their grandchildren. So they if there's such a huge family, they don't necessarily know each other, but they know each other, and they know they can count on each other, because the head of family take care of their dispute or their welfare. So there is someone who is selfless, who has benevolence, that makes sure everyone else can coexist peacefully. So it doesn't mean the father love their sons all the same. No, fathers always love some sons better than others. But then the father would have to treat them equally. So this is not about emotion. If you all go by emotion, then you always treat the one you love or like most better. But if it is your duty, then you must try to treat everyone equal, so people would not feel that can be left out in distribution of whatever entitlements. So I think that's the difference between universal love and benevolent love. So benevolent love is a duty. It's not about emotion.
Mhm. Okay, so then you also use these terms solidarity love and role embedded love. What can you explain those terms then?
Well, benevolent love it is not all the same in associated with different positions or different roles. So parents have parents' benevolent love, brothers have brothers' benevolent love, neighbors have neighbors' benevolent love. So benevolent love are different kind of love. It usually are given in some kind of material terms. At other times can be ritual. If it's a ritual, then certainly different roles would require different rituals. and showing of different kind of benevolence. So it is improper for a teacher to show benevolent love to her students by using brother and sister benevolent love. So role love is not the same with benevolent love, but role love is a way to ensure that the relationship between different people can continue without being suspected or being interfered by some other external factors. So benevolence reproduce roles, but then roles require different kind of benevolence.
Okay. So is there, I guess I'm still wondering about the relationship to what you call solidarity love then.
Okay. I think solidarity love is almost like a universal love. It's a love between people who feel for each other because they have certain kind of a prior resemblance. If we talk about completely strangers, then they all possess the same kind of universal human rights. So if their rights being violated, then we also being violated because we share the same universal human rights. So universal human rights, it's our resemblance. We resemble each other because we all have universal rights. So solidarity exists between even strangers who possess the same human rights. That means as long as we can imagine there is some kind of a prior resemblance between us, we can develop solidarity love, even though we don't know each other. But then benevolent love or role love would have to be related specifically via some kind of a rituals or via some kind of a gift giving or some kind of a mutual benevolence. Then you reproduced role love. And role love requires you, when playing your roles, you give up your self-interest. And solidarity love is different in the sense that when you provide support to each other, then you continue to be yourself. You don't give up yourself. Helping people is our truth, our own choice. It's our desire. It's not obligation. But in terms of role love, it's obligation. That's why it's not always emotional. It's not always emotionally positive. It can be the source of anxiety. But solidarity love is full of passion. It's enthusiasm. It's something that we feel we want to do. It's not because we taking certain roles and that we are obliged to do certain things.
Okay. So, I mean, there's this distinction, you know, Immanuel Kant in his ethics, he has this distinction between duty
Yeah,
and love.
right.
Is that somehow similar to this distinction you're making between a kind of role embedded love and a solidarity love?
Well, I think probably not. I think duty in the liberal tradition is more a communitarian duty, or it's a duty to help each other. But this duty comes from our own consciousness. It's us who um, appreciate or who understand this duty. So we can empathize with each other, even sympathetic with each other. But this is a communitarian kind of a duty. It's a duty of being a human being. This is different, I think, from
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I think there's a clear distinction, at least Kant makes a clear distinction between duty and love. And sort of duty really is something that's not so much about emotion. It really is about a kind of, I guess, ethical imperative, often based on roles. And so but there's a distinction. In fact, that duty for Kant is not love. It's like almost the opposite of love,
Oh
because
yeah,
it's
well,
not
but that
emotional.
Yeah, well, I guess in a sense that we don't have to consider this as a binary. It can be a degree of, from my point of view, what Kant was making was actually a degree on one dimension. The more you uh, feel for it, then the more emotional kind of love you are involved. And you can feel emotion about your duty, and you may not want to feel emotion about your duty. So there is a mix of both. But for conceptual distinctions, I think it's useful to look at the two extremes. One is being completely emotionally involved, but that doesn't preclude us from understanding the source or the origin of that love. That has something to do us as a human being. So you can stress it's not just your emotion, it's your duty. But then if you are somehow if we preach to people that it is their duty to support and help someone else whose rights are being violated, and that if we are persuasive enough, the person who go out and carry out their duties are also at the same time emotionally involved. So you can argue that emotion is one thing and duty is another thing. But if you compare with Confucian style of role love, then I would argue that they're just two sides of the same coin.
Well, maybe that is the difference then. Maybe, I mean, certainly Kant really wants to distinguish duty from love. They're really almost like opposites for him. And
Right.
what you're imagining or what you're explaining to us about this Confucian love is that duty and love are really kind of merged together, right?
Yeah, well, that's why I say Confucian love can be emotional, but it doesn't have to be. So if you're really into your role, you become so passionate about being a subordinate to your leaders, then you can be very emotional. Right?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Um, that's interesting. Okay. So yes, there's I guess you're setting up this contrast, not maybe not so much between two different kinds of love, but really two different relationships between love and duty.
Well, yeah, well, I guess maybe you can argue that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then you described a kind of Confucian critique of universal love. Can you talk about that?
Well, I guess it's um, this imagination of autonomous individuals that make Confucian scholars anxious. In Confucian role love, I mentioned earlier that individuals lose their individuality. They have to perform their roles by giving up their self concerns. Um, at least at a point of role play, they don't have a self. But in comparison, I think the autonomous individuals, they don't have to give up their self identities or their individuality or individualist consciousness. Um, so I think that's the difference. So for Confucian, if you have this benevolent love, it is the opposite to your self interest. But in the liberal societies, there is no such uh, um, request that you have to give up yourself in order to be either benevolent or to show your solidarity.
Mm,
So the Confucian role or Confucian scholars would feel anxious about autonomous individuals because when they show solidarities, they actually reproduce their individuality. And that means solidarity can be simply a preference, and the preferences can be changed. If everyone has different preference, then society cannot come together. So there is moment, especially during crisis, the society have to come together. The Confucian would um, the Confucian solution would be to request everyone give up their self-interest.
all right, let's shift over to this concrete case you talk about in Hong Kong. What does then the one country, two systems mean in Hong Kong then? And how did, yeah, and can you maybe
So
explain that? And
I
then,
think
yeah,
is a
go ahead.
is a is a way to restore Hong Kong's belonging to China after such a long period of colonization by the United Kingdom. But then how you get a capitalist system restore its belonging to a social system, especially at a time when socialism appears to be in a much vulnerable and weak position compared with capitalism. So you want Hong Kong to be part of China, restore its belonging to China, but you don't know how to do it. So you have this one country, two system idea. So the two systems actually remain separate. So there was no a practical belonging of Hong Kong to China, but in name, Hong Kong become part of China. So there's one country, that's the name. So you'll be part of China. And the two systems that we remain separately, socialism and capitalism, we don't interfere with one another. So Hong Kong should remain as it is. And in order to prove that, the prosperity of Hong Kong must be some must be continued. Otherwise, that means that the motherland hurt Hong Kong. So you have this idea of one country, two systems. So you don't really intervene or interfere with affairs, governance of Hong Kong. So that's the idea of one country, two system. That Deng Xiaoping later on said that you have to love Hong Kong in order, or you have to love China or love the country. That means you love China, you love Hong Kong, in order to be the governor of Hong Kong. So the governor of Hong Kong must someone who loves the country and also who loves Hong Kong. And then this kind of love, of course, had nothing to do with emotion. The government doesn't have to really physically feel that she or he loved Hong Kong. The request, of course, is that if you can maintain stability and give welfare to the population in Hong Kong, then you qualify as someone who loved the country. And so you have to judge this person by the results of her governance. So this is the idea of one country, two systems. And it seems to me that's very Confucian. It's not emotion, it's about benevolence. And it tries to demonstrate Beijing as a Chinese central authority has no self-interest. The only concern is to keep Hong Kong as affluent as possible. I think that's the original idea, theoretical.
Right. So, but then we end up then with these two different interpretations of, so that, we had these protests in Hong Kong in 2014,
Yeah,
2019.
right.
So what are the two different interpretations of these protests based on this idea of universal love and then the idea of benevolent love?
From the benevolent love point of view, Hong Kong people have no rights. They have no entitlements. They are able to enjoy what they are because the benevolence of the central government. And for Hong Kong people, of course, they succeeded quite different colonial culture, that people are entitled to their rights. If they have their rights, and of course, they should elect their own government. And they should have a say and they should be allowed to participate in policy process. And that means the ultimate power to decide who rules Hong Kong and how Hong Kong should be ruled are in the hands of the Hong Kong people, because that's their natural rights. But that would ruin Beijing's notion of one country, because the whole reason that Beijing would hope that you enjoy stability and prosperity was because you are Chinese. That's why we care about you. And if you want to remain more connected with your former colonial country, Great Britain, than with China, then there was no reason for us to show benevolent love. So there's this very different understanding of who should rule Hong Kong, who are entitled to what. For Beijing, of course, if you stick to one country, you allow the basic law to be subordinate to the interpretation of National People's Congress. Then you will continue your efforts. But then that's very much a violation of universal rights, because we never in Hong Kong never agreed, we never give consent to be ruled by People's National Congress, and that's our natural rights. Everyone should give consent to how they should be ruled. So you have this kind of a misinterpretation, and you see both sides feeling they're very much justified in their own tradition of thought.
So you see this conflict between Hong Kong and then the Chinese government, but you also then link these two. You link benevolent love with stability and prosperity, and then universal love with autonomy and political rights.
Right.
And so that seems to be the way that they divide up. But why should there? Why is there a conflict between these two sets of goals?
Because this is how things are being practiced on the ground. It's not theoretically they don't have to be, and practically they don't have to be that way. But as events turn out, as events evolved, and people start relying on some kind of a discursive justification of their own behavior, they start enlisting different intellectual resources. And then it becomes something that they could never understand each other, because benevolent love and universal love treat Hong Kong completely differently. In the benevolent love tradition, Hong Kong is part of China, is entitled to affluence prosperity only when Hong Kong belongs to China. But from benevolent love point of view, that we get solidarity support from the United States, from Taiwan, from Great Britain, from anywhere in the world. That's natural. That's how people worry about the entitlements or rights situation in Hong Kong. So they all jump in to help. They come in to help because we're all human beings. And because we're human beings, then Hong Kong are no longer considered being Chinese, or their Chineseness is becoming less relevant to their universal human beings. And then that would disqualify them from benevolence of the central government. So they become increasingly and intensely, in contradiction. But you could also see people on the street of Hong Kong. They are capable of exerting both kinds of love. But then when they fall back to their discursive justification, then this binary sort of occupy the way they look at things. Their lens, their worldviews become occupied. They become constituted by this binary kind of thoughts. But then in practice, you do see people in Hong Kong can practice different kinds of love, and there are many ways of doing this in a blended way, right? You can take turns. You can be benevolent. You can show benevolence, love in certain conditions, and then showing solidarity, love in other conditions. So you take turns. You can also doing this cycling, right? You can show benevolent love in a long haul of history, perhaps in 500 years later. You may see Hong Kong population exerting benevolent love in one period of time and universal love in another period of time. They take turns. So they can be horizontally divided, So you take different roads, you shift according to the conditions. It can be also vertical. So the majority of the population can practice different love more than the other kind of love, depending on the ethos of the time. So there are many ways of blending this.
I suppose, but I mean, I think at issue recently in Hong Kong has really the structure of sovereignty and how it's going to be ruled, right? So that you don't only you have to pick one direction in a sense, right? And I guess recently it's been going in just one direction as well, right?
Right. Yeah. But I think it's like bilingual family. Then you force the children to choose one language. It's almost impossible. They would experience split inside because you don't choose for them. It was probably natural in the beginning that to speak both language naturally, and they know what language to use to speak to whom in what condition. They switch naturally. But then if one day the parents force them to choose, so you have to speak only one language, then you will have a problem.
Right. So isn't that what's happened then?
Yeah, well, I guess that's how when this kind of practical condition, especially this hybrid post-colonial society, being forced to choose sides. And that's not just happened in Hong Kong. That almost happened everywhere in the world. It's not just post-colonial world in former colonies, but also in former colonial power. They also experience this kind of division, right? Because they get all those migrants from their former colonies into their own society. And then they face this division, which they create for themselves. And then they force people to choose sides. They weaponize their migrant identities, and it's not just in Hong Kong, it's almost everywhere in the world.
You mean you see a kind of division within countries?
Yes, and
Yeah.
they are all related to past colonial relations,
Yeah.
including
Well,
former colonies and the former colonial powers.
let's just stick with China and Hong Kong. I mean,
Yeah,
so
sure.
you're arguing that the problem between China and Hong Kong is because Hong Kong has been colonized, and therefore they have this sort of uh, I guess mindset of the colonizers. Is that the idea, or is it?
No, I mean, because Hong Kong is being colonized, so they are in a situation that better for them not to choose sides. But if you force them to choose side, the problem is that you force them to choose side. It's not they're being post-colonial. I think everyone is being post-colonial, right? It's practically everyone is being post-colonial. But if you force people to choose sides, then they can no longer flexibly adjust to whichever encountering they're experiencing. People are able to adapt to conditions, to different conditions. But then if you force them to choose side, you examine them as one consistent identity and request them to act like that, then you have a problem.
All right. Okay. Well, so that's what you're saying the problem has been in Hong Kong, right?
Right? I think the problem has been in Hong Kong and everywhere else. It's for people forcing each other to choose sides.
Yes. So, but there, I mean, at this point, right, China has forced Hong Kong into a particular mode of sovereignty, and
Right.
there's no choice for for the
I think I'm
for
more
Hong Kong.
confident. I think I'm more confident than you are in Hong Kong people. I think there are
Okay.
many there are many ways to evade this. And for Chinese, it's not one single Hong Kong person come out to protest. It's more of a lot of Hong Kong people who act in a perhaps not coordinated way to alienate from China or their Chinese identity. That would become a threat to Beijing, and Beijing would have to adapt. It's not because they are in a more powerful position, they can determine what you think in your mind. And that's also happening in everywhere in China, even under this very strong political leadership. There's still many ways spontaneously showing loyal people are incapable to continue their loyalty because they're dying of hunger, they're dying of starvation, they don't have business to run like the white paper protest during the last period of a quarantine. People could not sustain their life anymore. So a lot of unpredictable behavior will show up, and that spread very fast. And then it is the authority who would have to adjust because it is their legitimacy being ruined. So we don't know what would happen. I think what threatened the autocratic leadership is that they don't know what happened. They don't have enough information. So anything that drastic could happen overnight. So that forced them to listen and try to make an adjustment. So I think in a longer period of time, we will see an adjustment. And in the shorter period of time, we will see a lot of evolution going on. Like one country system suffers evolution in 2014 and 2019. There's a very serious evolution that the one country, that the system didn't work well. Then you have to find a way to recover. It's possible that you're never going to recover. That's possible. But it's also possible they can recover if the leadership adjusts. And I think the leadership would ultimately, they would have to adjust.
Okay. So you didn't talk about this in your essay, but one question that comes to mind for me now is the do you see the relationship between China and Hong Kong as analogous to the relationship at all between China and Taiwan?
In the sense of forcing people to choose side, yes, it is. But in terms of how, and there's also very important similarity between Hong Kong and Taiwan. I think both places are perhaps the only colonies in the world when the colonial powers left, the local population didn't take over the regime. It was a migrant regime coming from China to take over. So when people, the local population could not take over and establish their own regime, and they become somewhat inferior because they were colonized before. So they were not as pure as the regime that takes over. However, there's a way for them to regain their self-respect. That is to fall back on colonial modernity. That's how they feel they are superior to the Chinese people. So if they fall back to colonial modernity, then they would have to forget whatever bad things colonizer did in history. This is the condition requests them to forget about that temporarily, so they could rely on colonial modernity and appear to be superior to a civilization who is come to take over. So this becomes a problem. In other parts of the world, colonies reestablish their regime and then reconnect relationship with former colonial powers. That's their choice. And they still have their own government, their own regime. So they could do that with some kind of dignity. But in Hong Kong, Taiwan, there was no such room for local people to feel being respected by the regime that took over after colonial powers left. And that almost, I think, forced them to rely on, to retrieve their colonial modernity in order to regain their self-respect.
What does that mean in Taiwan right now?
That means to reconnect to United States, European, and claim universal human rights. and China being a site where human rights are constantly violated, and Chinese people coming to Taiwan, they should not, they're not, they don't deserve the same universal human rights because they come from China. So you have identity politics going on. Those people who are entitled to rights, they are higher people. that's Taiwanese people. So
Oh, but that seems contradictory. If they're adhering to universal human rights, then there's no distinction. I mean, there shouldn't be any classes, right?
So you see the claim to universal human rights is identity strategy rather than belief in universal human rights.
That's how it's. You mean that's how you interpret all human rights discourse, or are
No,
you
no,
talking about just specifically in Taiwan?
I'm talking about specifically in Taiwan. I think there are other places similar to that, but um, for the sake of our discussion, I think yes, I I I was talking about Taiwan today.
I see. Oh, okay, interesting. Okay. Um, well, thank you very much for your insights into what's going on in Hong Kong and in China. Let me just remind our listeners, this is Chih, whose essay "Loving Hong Kong: Unity and Solidarity in the Politics of Belonging" appeared in Telos 202. And thank you very much, Chih, for speaking with me today.
Thank you, David. Thank you.